were playing in the hockey arena, it sometimes could be compared to like human pinball, and it was a higher scoring game than the traditional outdoor soccer, and it was perhaps a better TV sport in our eyes, that it was going to catch on pretty quickly. And playing with this orange and black ball with a different set of rules, the nonstop substitutions, and it was catching on, but we weren't selling tickets at the prices to really function as a profitable business. So there were just too many times when you had to dress the house or constantly reduce ticket prices, with groups. And it was a real challenge. I mean, you really got nervous. And, I got to work in the New York market, but, some of these secondary areas were starting to take off. I mean, you go to St. Louis or Kansas City, and they were talking sellouts as the league started to grow. So in the markets where you weren't competing with a New York or a Washington Redskins kind of thing, you could be pretty successful because you were kind of the only game in town.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Yes, it's that time again, friends. Hi, Tim Hanlon here. How are you? Thanks for joining me, and it's Good Seats Still Available, as announced, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. We are often accused, and rightly so, for spending quite a bit of time here on this podcast, at least in our early weeks, around professional soccer. Arguably the one of the key reasons for starting this little show, and we are guilty as charged, and we admit it. But we have spent most of our time until now focused on NASL, outdoor soccer exploits. We really haven't touched on an equally, in many respects, even more fascinating league called the MISL, or the Major Indoor Soccer League, at least the original version of it that ran from roughly 1978 to, I guess, the early 90s or so. And for a good part of the latter part of the decade of the 80s, was the top-tier professional soccer league in the United States. And in many respects, I think not only kept the sport alive, but frankly doesn't get a whole lot of credit for doing so. And obviously we know what the state of the sport is today because of those efforts. Our guest today is a guy named Menchel, who with PR and operations management, general management roles in a whole bunch of teams in the old MISL, had a front row seat to a lot of the fun, the frivolity, the in some cases shenanigans around this very interesting and innovative and disruptive league, and from a fan's perspective was just a white hot comet, not just in Kansas City, wink, wink, nod, nod, of fun and excitement and action. And it's something we're going to start our MISL explorations with today with Menchel in our conversation in a couple of seconds. I think if you remember teams like the New York Arrows, the Baltimore Blast, even if you remember the Hartford Hellions, this is the podcast for you. But we'll also, fear not, also touch on some old NASL memories with the Colorado Caribous, that one-year wonder of 1978, where Menchel got his pro soccer start. And your football fans should stick around as well, because Michael's journeys also took him, after actually starting in the NFL, and we'll talk about that with the Washington Redskins, to the St. Louis Football Cardinals back in the day as well. So you should, all of you fans of those teams and more, will likely enjoy our conversation with Menchel in just a couple of seconds. Before we get to Menchel and our chat, I again want to remind you that Audible is our sponsor of this episode and for numerous episodes thus far, and we thank them for doing so. And we also thank you, hopefully, for trying them out. If you want a free audiobook download and a free 30-day trial of Audible's audiobook service, which has over 180,000 titles to choose from, that being the premier provider of digital audiobooks, Audible is. That plays on just about any device you can think of, iPhone or Kindle or Android or any other 500 plus devices. Audible is yours for the free trying at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, that's a free trial, 30 days in length, as well as a free audiobook download if you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. It is a fine service. I love it to death. I listen to books all the time, and Audible is the awesome way to do so. Again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. Give it a try. You'll find great stuff in nonfiction and fiction. You name the genre, they pretty much have it. Again, you can cancel at any time. And it's worth, I think, at the very least, for trying out a free audiobook download by going to audibletrial.com/goodseats. I trust that you will enjoy it as much as I do. Okay. Promotional messaging out of the way. Let's get to our conversation with the very interesting Michael Menchel here on the podcast. So maybe we can start near the beginning. It seems to me that your first sort of taste of professional soccer heartache and joy was in '78 with the Caribou of Colorado. Is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Maybe before we even get there, what was your life like at the time before you got there? And more interestingly, how did you jump in, I guess?
Okay. I went to college in Washington, D.C. I went to American University, and I went primarily to play soccer. And I studied communications. So in my junior year, I was lucky enough to get an internship at the local ABC affiliate. And I was basically a weekend copy boy and kind of worked my way up to weekday copy boy while I was in school, and got hired by the TV station when I graduated in '74. So I asked the sports guy, because like yourself, I'm a sports nut. I said, I'd like to go out to Redskin Park someday. And he says, well, it's very hard to get there. It's like the White House. You know, they don't let you. I said, I'm just throwing it out there if a situation ever comes up. And like 2 or 3 weeks later, he said, George Allen said, you can come out and meet you. So I said, cool. So I put on the one suit I had in college and tie and kind of buffed up my afro hairdo and went out there, and it was like a fortress. First of all, it was a long way out. It was by Dulles Airport. And from Washington, D.C., I kept saying, gosh, that's a long way for sportscasters to go just to do, a 3-minute piece. So all the players were out there. I never saw an AstroTurf football field in person. It was pretty cool having natural grass and artificial turf side by side, and everybody in their perfect uniforms. And all of a sudden, this head coach comes jogging out, and the sports director introduces him to me, and I know it's like 6 minutes before practice is supposed to start. And we started talking, give him a firm handshake, and he said, do you ever think of getting into public relations? And I said, yes, that would be great. He says, well, there's an opening for a PR assistant with the Redskins because the previous guy went to the World Football League. And okay, shook his hand. He said, I'd like you to write down 10 things you can do to help the Redskins win, and send it to me. Okay. Shook hands again, and, they started practice. We had to leave the area. They put the blinds down in the PR office. It's a closed practice. I go back in the car with the sports guy and just wrote down 10 things, and frankly, some of the things I said were, I don't know the difference between a guard and a tackle. I'm a New York Giants fan. And he apparently liked what I wrote. He invited me back for an interview, being a little more of the geekish, prepared type. I read his book, which wasn't very good, but I read it, and I came to the interview and 1 or 2 occasions quoted something from his book, and he seemed to like that, and hired me. And I was like flipped out. And I never met the PR director. And my first day on the job, there's Joe Blair, who is a senior PR person, and he'd been there many years. And after some time, I realized that he was going to spend the rest of his life as the head PR guy. And I said, oh, gosh, I'm going to be the backup, but boy, I'm in the NFL, and I'm going to learn some fun stuff. And basically, 8-9 months later, I'm at my grandmother's place in Florida for spring break time of year, my first vacation. And I remember vividly My grandmother, in a Eastern European German accent, says, in the afternoon, I got like too much sun the first day, and she's overfeeding me. And she says, Tatala, Alan's on the phone from Washington. And I'm going, Alan, thinking first name Alan, I have no idea who it is. And it was George Allen. And he says, Mike, that bastard Joe Blair, he went to work for Ed Garvey in the Players Association. And I said, oh my gosh, I had no inkling that he was being recruited. And a very loyal guy, Joe Blair, and really took me under his wing. And he said, get on the first plane back and don't tell anybody why you're coming back. So I mentioned to my grandmother that I was leaving right now, and there was a 5:30 flight from Miami to Washington National then, and she thought I got fired. And I got back, my roommate in Rockville, Maryland, why are you back so early? And I can't tell you. Went to Redskins Park the next day, which is a 35-mile drive from my apartment. And my assistant, Diane, is there, and she goes, what are you doing back? Can't tell you. And I walk in, and George Allen says, it's either you or Jack Zane from the University of Maryland. And I'm kind of like, well, that guy's got a lot more experience than me and is very well regarded. And a few minutes later, he says, you got the job, and he hands me a 2-year contract. And it was like rubber stamped by Pete Rozelle. And it was like some kind of official NFL contract. And, I'm 21 and a half years old. I'm not going to turn it down. And I'm ecstatic. And all of a sudden, I'm sitting in Joe Blair's chair at his pretty desk overlooking the field. And that's how I got into professional sports.
All right. So at that point, though, it seems like you kind of had your gold ticket then, right? So how did and for those listeners who've never lived in the D.C. area, I went to undergrad myself in the D.C. area, worked there for a little while in TV news, and Redskins fever that's not even the right word to describe it. I mean, especially at that time, right, where it's kind of really. You're
exactly right, because at that time, the Caps, I'm a season ticket holder to the Caps, and the Bullets were really second-tier citizens in this community because everybody was diehard Redskins fans because of the history. The Caps were new. The Bullets had just moved from Baltimore pretty recently. And I literally, as I got going in the job, George Allen could announce to me that we signed 3 draft picks or signed 3 players. Instead of giving it to the media one shot, I could spread it out over 3 days, and it would be, most of the time, the lead story. And unlike today's times, you really could have a lot to do with the way things were positioned and when it got out. And you did it when you wanted to do it. And it was absolutely fabulous. I remember just going on my first trip as an advanced person. I said, is this a mistake? This is a first-class plane ticket. And she goes, oh, all department heads go first class. And I just freaked out. And I got to tell you something funny. We played the Cincinnati Bengals. So as a PR guy, I would go out on Tuesday for a Sunday game, and I go to the Bengals training camp, give a brief talk to the media, hand out videotapes, really an exciting job. Hand out videotapes, give pictures to the 2 local daily newspapers, and maybe do a radio interview or meet with some radio people or set some things up. And I had a Bloody Mary because I was flying first class on this airplane in the morning. And all of a sudden, the announcer goes, we're about to land in Covington, Kentucky. And I started freaking out. I got on the wrong plane, And I wasn't on the wrong plane. When you fly into the Cincinnati airport, it happens to be just over the river in Kentucky. I think that's the last time I had a beverage of that kind when I was advancing a game. And I got to see a lot of the United States, and I got to go ahead of the team and represent the Redskins, and it was absolutely a dream job. It really was.
All right. So give us some insight then as to how you would take that dream job and think that the dream would be even further extended in the fledgling sport of professional soccer circa 78 in Denver, Colorado, of all places.
So I've always loved soccer, as I said in my little thing with George Allen, that I didn't know a guard from a tackle, and working for the NFL, it's kind of a lifetime job. And I got approached by two men, Dan Wood and Dave. I forgot his last name.
Would this be the coach, Dave Clements?
Dave Clements.
Yep.
Yes, thank you. And they said, would you be interested in coming to Colorado? And, I know how beautiful Colorado is. And I met them at the Twin Bridges Marriott, which no longer exists. We had breakfast together. And I flew out to Denver very discreetly and was blown away by the Rocky Mountains, by a new team owned by a rock star producer and a famous lumber company in the great Northwest, and the chance to do something in Mile High Stadium, and even an increase in salary. So I'd been at the Redskins for about 4 years, and it was great. And my contract was coming up anyway, and I just decided to part ways. And, some of my friends thought I was crazy, but, loving soccer, I took the opportunity and moved to Colorado and bought a townhouse and started working for the team as director of operations. The only problem was a big one. The attendance was really hurting. It was Orange Crush fans, it was Denver Broncos, and it was really a tough sell because it was a small soccer market at that time and a huge stadium to fill. If we were in a smaller 20,000 seat, facility, it would look a lot better and be more soccer fan friendly. So I stayed there, and all of a sudden the team is moving to Atlanta. It was a purchase, and I was engaged to a woman whose former lived in Atlanta, and she said she didn't want to go there. And I said, okay, and sold my townhouse. And a man named Bernie Roden called me up and said, they're starting this indoor soccer league, and we're going to get the New York franchise, and can I hire you as a consultant to come to the first league meeting? I went to the league meeting, and there were 6 teams, 6 owners, and the big name was Pete Rose, was an owner of the Cincinnati Kids, and I was really intrigued by being part of a new league, and Earl Foreman was the commissioner, and even though there were a lot of rookies in the room, it was exciting to be part of launching of a new league. And the gentleman, Bernie Roden, introduced me to his partner, John Luciani, and I became general manager of the New York team. And 4 or 5 months later, our first game was against the Cincinnati Kids. And Pete Rose was the name owner, and we are putting, literally where the New York Islanders played, we're putting AstroTurf product right on top of the ice for the first time. Came from Georgia. It was really an 11th hour production getting this ready. And I remember walking on it saying, oh, it's so cold and there's some seams here. Someone could get hurt. And just prior to that, the Cincinnati team wanted one of our players, a guy named Mario Garcia, I believe. And they said, what do you want for him? And I said, I'd like Pete Rose to kick out the first ball. And the general manager of the team said to me, is that all you want? I said, yes. So he said, sure. Never checked with Pete Rose. He just told me sure. And the opening game in the history of the league was I have actually a framed picture of the scoreboard at the end of the game of the Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum, where Pete Rose, who then was thinking of going to the Philadelphia Phillies, showed up in a private plane in a leather jacket, collared shirt, casual slacks, and he kicked out the first ball, this orange and black ball, and it got the media, including the New York Times, to come out to Uniondale, New York, to the opening game of this fledgling league. And we unfortunately had to paper the house because even though Long Island was a hotbed of recreation soccer, the ticket sales just weren't there, despite, decent amount of print advertising. And it looked like quite an event for the opening day. And my team won the game, and Pete Rose kicked out the first ball, and we had a bunch of nice media coverage, really because of Pete Rose, not so much from the Arrows. We signed Shep Messing as a goalie, who was a big-name soccer person, and the owner of the team had more to do with that than I, because it was quite a negotiation for a lot more money than anybody else in the league was paying. And that was my start.
Yeah, so much to unpack there. But let me let's back up here for a second. So I actually a couple of years ago made a pilgrimage to the sports memorabilia store that Pete Rose literally spends about 4 or 5 days a week sitting and signing autographs for $50, $60, $80 pop.
Wow.
And brought a printout of, I think, what is now an iconic picture, and I'd love to get a more, quality or original version of it, of Mr. Rose kicking out that first ball at that first game. And in that picture, you see Earl Foreman, I think, on the right-hand side. We'll post this on the site when this episode is up. And on the left, I think John Luciani is clapping, and then there's the team sort of kind of in awe behind Rose, kind of, like they can't believe that this is happening kind of thing. And I asked Rose about it. I said, he was literally, there was nobody there the day I went. This was around a conference I was at. And I said, I got something for you here. And I showed him the picture, and he looked at it and he kind of fuzzily. And then he started to sort of pick out, he said soccer, he said Cincinnati, right? And then I think he might have mentioned one or two of the names, like John Luciani, perhaps. And then that was it. He really didn't. He didn't really he didn't regale me nearly with as much detail as you just did.
Yes. Yeah. Unfortunately, I have a very good memory of all those minutia things from many years back, and it was just so exciting because it was the first game. And I remember some guy wrote an article. A guy named Don Marcus wrote an article for Newsday, and he talked about my clammy hands, because I was so nervous of something going wrong, of a player tripping on the artificial turf as the game started, or frankly, we don't have enough turf to cover the hockey rink. There were so many variables that you were nervous about. We practiced at a high school gym in Queens, and it was, quite an undertaking, with foreign players and the domestic players and, visas. And I literally made more trips to immigration than you'd ever believe. Even the owner, there were two owners of the team, Bernie Roden and John Luciani. And Bernie Roden kind of was the one who recruited me, and John Luciani was the front and center, high-profile owner of the team, and all he wanted to do was win a championship at whatever cost it, took. And we were able to sign a few talented foreign players that really helped us, especially in that first season.
Well, okay. So again, I'm going to back up a second. So you're the Caribou of Colorado, which, by the way, has its own sort of interesting stories, right? I mean, we kind of glossed over the whole Jim Jaresh. How do you say
Jimmy Guercio?
Jimmy Guercio, right? So obviously, well-known music producer. And if you ask the band Chicago about their feelings about him, they may have not so fond memories of his management of their career. And apparently, I guess the Caribou Ranch, his studio, was really the inspiration for the name of the team, right?
That's correct. In fact, when I shared with you that I was engaged to this lady, he told me that I could have my honeymoon at the Caribou Ranch. And, he had the players up there and the front office, and it was just a fabulous retreat, maybe an hour from Denver. And it was just in the middle of nowhere. And the Chicago albums, many of them were produced right there, but it was a ongoing business where if you and I had a rock group and we wanted to cut an album, you would go there for a week or a month. And if you wanted lobster, if you wanted to go horseback riding, you wanted to get a certain movie back in those days, he took care of everything. His people had that place running, and it was really isolated from the rest of the world. And it was just kind of a special place. But he wanted to bring his Hollywood friends to Mile High Stadium. I remember a couple times he brought some actors, and the fact that Mile High Stadium was not filled up and he's in the owner's box, he was perturbed about it. And, it created some tension. But, the indoor and outdoor soccer leagues, had some challenges. Unless you were the Cosmos, capacity was not something that, was something that you were able to fill up.
All right, I don't want to dwell too much time on Colorado, because I do want to get to this MISL stuff, because that it has a whole realm of fascination for me. But I do have to ask you about two little things, I guess, in that regard, right? So we're talking about literally a one-year wonder in the NASL, and you had somebody obviously in the music business. It seemed to me that was around the time when you had a lot of people in the not only entertainment business, but specifically the music industry, becoming somehow fascinated and or dragged into this, I don't know, pixie dust of the explosion, at least it perceived, of professional soccer at the time, right? You had Elton John with the LA Aztecs. You had the consortium there in Philadelphia with the Fury. I'm wondering if there was any sort of inside club, musicians society, so to speak, that was kind of wending its way through NASL ownership at the time, or was this just sort of a side thing that?
No, it was truly a side thing. With the Erdogan's, owning the Cosmos, they were truly, humongous, music producers when they had Pele and, were getting Canalia and getting 77,000 people to many of the home games at Giant Stadium. And frankly, for us in Denver, our whole season revolved not so much around Jimmy Guercio's friends coming or a bunch of rock stars coming to us, but when the Cosmos came with Pele, that's when we had a big crowd. That's when we had, a post-game party that was, filled up a lot more than all the other games combined, just because Pele, was gracious enough to give some of his time before they jetted back to the East Coast. So really, it was the Cosmos coming for one game. And fortunately, it was a home game, was more important, it seemed, in the eyes of the owners and many of the fans than the whole season. And the players had these crazy uniforms with fraying around the midriff and a really cool logo. And we had satin jackets when we traveled. I mean, these rock star jackets. And unfortunately, I moved from one city to another with soccer, and it was in storage, and somehow through the moving company, it got ripped off. And that, of all the teams I've worked with, I think I've worked with 7 teams, my favorite piece of memorabilia was that satin Caribous of Colorado jacket. And it is no more. And I had a jersey, too, that I actually sent to Ted Howard in the North American Soccer League just as a gesture of some memorabilia to keep in what I hope would be a museum someday.
Well, I think that both of those items should be when the National Soccer Hall of Fame gets reopened. I think it's late next year now at suburban Dallas near the FC Dallas Stadium. I think both of those items in a Smithsonian-like manner should be there, because I agree that logo, the Caribou of Colorado logo, is I think elegant and way ahead of its time.
Yeah, and I still have some programs and like yearbooks, my business card. I had a business card from the Redskins and from the St. Louis Football Cardinals, but the business card from the Caribous, of all the ones I've had, was by far the most elegant. It was just so beautifully done, even though we only drew, 5,000 or 6,000 paid fans a game to Mile High Stadium in those days.
All right, two little nits, and then we'll move on. I promise. The appellation of the team, right? So the official title of the team was what?
The Caribous of Colorado.
Okay, and Caribous is plural. Okay, so for wordsmiths out there, that's already, I think, a challenge or maybe even a question. But obviously, it's known as Colorado Caribous, right? In terms of programs and that kind of stuff. I mean, did that ever? I know it's a small nit, maybe a PR / English major journalism thing, but did that ever trip you up at all because you've got the sort of formal name and the sort of informal name, or did it not matter?
No, it did not matter, actually. And people never really questioned it.
Interesting.
It just kind of, people accepted it. And, we had trouble just, getting 2 inches a copy after a game and, the Denver Post or the Rocky Mountain News, because, it was all about the Broncos and the Denver Nuggets.
All right, so much for that theory. So I apologize to our listeners, but I try to go through every little dark corner that I can.
Sure.
But let's go back to that uniform for a second, because it is iconic for whatever reason. Do you have any idea? So were you part of that creation? How did that? How did you?
No.
Okay. How did that come about?
And
who designed it? Yeah.
It was already in the production stage. So. I think I literally missed 1 or 2 games when the season started. So I went aboard as director of operations and was trying to enhance the public relations and travel to a number of games, with the team. And I literally was given a furnished apartment, promised a car, and my car happened to be a 12-passenger van. And I literally, when the team would have a road game, they'd all gather at the office and they'd hop in my van, and I'd drop the team off at the airport and drive around as a single man in his 20s with this commercial-looking van in the Denver market. But, my deal was that I got a car. It wasn't specified what it was, but I really was the hauler of the players for many of the games.
Do you think Guercio's troubles, I think the timing was about right, with the band Chicago and the discovery of his, not uncommon for the music industry, but his financial dealings with the band, was that perhaps a reason why the team was ultimately sold to Atlanta? Because it seems like it was about the same time that those things came to light, those music issues. Yes.
That was certainly a catalyst in getting rid of the team, because we had another faction of ownership that was in the state of Washington, and Jimmy Guercio was, the one who was controlling it financially.
Very interesting. Okay, so you mentioned, so let's shift gears. You mentioned Bernie Rodin, right? So he ostensibly is the guy that kind of pulls you into this new sort of uncharted world of the major indoor soccer league.
Yes.
Were you, besides it being a new league, and obviously you've got soccer interest and background, but given your experiences in Colorado, right, not necessarily sort of gangbusters at the gate, et cetera, was there any arched eyebrow as you sort of decided to continue into soccer and yet now an unproven kind of environment?
No, as a single guy and having some experience in professional football, I felt like, my experience could be an advantage, and I really enjoyed, from an entrepreneurial point of view, of let's find a practice facility, who do we contact to get artificial turf? I mean, it was like kind of going in the yellow pages or just making a lot of phone calls by word of mouth, and it was really exciting to be, a part of that. We signed Shep Messing, and the owner says, let's do a press conference at 21 in New York. I said, at 21? That's going to cost a fortune. Don't worry about it. And we had no problem getting the media there because, frankly, it was the 21 club, and they got a free meal. And, John wanted to win, and John wanted John Luciani wanted the media coverage, and that's what we did. In fact, when I moved from Denver to New York, it was pretty much a lateral salary move for me. And after 1 week, I realized, living in New York, which is where I'm from, was so much more expensive than Colorado. I walked into John's office and said, this may sound odd to you. I've only been here a few weeks, but I need a raise. And I give you my word, the cost of living has blown me away. And he gave it to me. If he said no, I would have continued, of course. I'm a person of my word. I'd signed the contract. But, I just realized foolishly that, living in the New York market was a lot different than living in Denver in those days.
All right. So how did you, so having grown up around that time in the New York metropolitan area myself, I had vivid memories of seeing that sort of light green carpet in my haze by babysitting for kids locally in the middle, late at night, I think on Channel 11, tape delayed. I guess it was Terry Lewicki and Kyle Rowe Jr.
Yes, Kyle Rowe Jr.
doing the games. And I was just fascinated by this sort of, and being a huge soccer fan of the outdoor cosmos, this sort of, this little party that seemed to be going on in the wilds of Long Island. How did you successfully punch the Arrows, besides their quality of play, which obviously was very high for the first 4 years of the league, into the consciousness of New York metropolitan area sports fans?
Well, we're playing in the hockey arena. It sometimes could be compared to like human pinball, and it was a higher scoring game than the traditional outdoor soccer, and it was perhaps a better TV sport in our eyes, that it was going to catch on pretty quickly. And playing with this orange and black ball with a different set of rules, the nonstop substitutions, and it was catching on, but we weren't selling tickets at the prices to really function as a profitable business. So there were just too many times when you had to dress the house or constantly reduce ticket prices, with groups. And it was a real challenge. I mean, you really got nervous. And, I got to work in the New York market, but, some of these secondary areas were starting to take off. I mean, you go to St. Louis or Kansas City, and they were talking sellouts as the league started to grow. So in the markets where you weren't competing with a New York or a Washington Redskins kind of thing, you could be pretty successful because you were kind of the only game in town.
And it's clear, though, that the talent on the field obviously was extremely strong and dominating for those years. But this was also, though, around the time the Islanders were kind of dominating the NHL. Did that have any halo effect?
No, it really didn't. The Islanders had their loyal, sold-out season ticket base. And, we shared the arena with them, and I remember the ticket manager would just kind of laugh because he didn't have much to do with the Islanders because the tickets were already sold before the season started. And we have the same ticket manager for the Islanders as we did for the New York Arrows. And he had a much more complicated job just, giving it to, the soccer coach who's got 28 people coming and the logistics of meeting and getting this and that done. It just became a lot more complicated for him. But we had a lot of trouble. We got media coverage, but it just wasn't paying off at the turnstile.
So let's talk about Bernie Roden for a second, if you know him, because he seems to be the linchpin for some of your future gigs in the MISL. But I'm also really curious because you mentioned a little bit of time in your background about working with the Rochester Lancers, but that's not by coincidence, right? That Rochester Lancers job and or relationship with respect to the Arrows, right?
Correct. And just to go back a step, so one of the original teams was the Houston Summit Soccer, and John Luciani, Bernie's partner, his son owned the Houston Summit Soccer. So in the second season of the Arrows, in December, I remember it was just cold and snowy in the New York area, as it is all the time in December. He said, would you consider going to Houston? The man who's running that team has done some things that we don't think are so honorable. And I said, sure. So literally 2 days later, I'm on an airplane to Houston. Kenny Cooper was the coach, and I took over for this gentleman named Burl Cohen. And literally, they had someone drive my car down and gave me a furnished apartment, and I started working with Houston Summit Soccer with Kenny Cooper. And we had a very successful team on the field, but again, the joke around the Houston market was the three teams in town, the three sports that are most popular are high school soccer, high school football, college football, and pro football. So soccer was really way back there. And John Luciani's son ran the team. So I stayed there for one season working with Kenny Cooper. We won our division. We were runner-ups to the New York Arrows in the championship game. And it was very awkward for me. And, walking around as the general manager, I'd work for the other team and, sign many of the players that were on the opposing team. But, here I was wearing my Houston outfit, if you will, hoping to topple them for the championship.
All right. So I was at that championship game, as a matter of fact, in New York.
Oh, you were?
Yeah, strangely.
So then Bernie said to me, in his New York accent, "Hey, kid, we have an ownership in the Rochester Lancers of the North American Soccer League. Now that the indoor season's over, would you consider coming up to Rochester and be the general manager of the team?" So I flew up to Rochester with him from New York, and it was just a horrible day weather-wise. I met the other owners, and they were not impressive. I talked to some of the employees, and they were worried about their last paycheck. I asked if I could read the newspaper clippings of the previous year in town, and there was a lot of negativity. And I said, they asked me to sit in this other room, and they had their board meeting, and they came out, "Congratulations, you're the general manager. We voted you unanimously." And I said, "Thank you, but I will decline the invitation." And I remember getting off the plane with Bernie, and I don't know if it was the Democrat and Chronicle or the Times Union, one of the two Rochester papers, actually had my picture on the front page of the newspaper, the front page, not the sports section, Menchel to be named Lancers GM. And I wish I had a copy of the newspaper still, because it just totally caught me off guard. And having met the local owners, I just didn't feel comfortable like it was going to be a good fit or a right career move for me. And I got on the plane with Bernie going back, and in his accent, "I admire you, kid. Turning down the thing, I'm going to have something, we'll keep you and you'll have something to do, and I admire you for turning them down," in so many words. So it was, a good feeling, at least, going back when I said no thank you. It was just a dreary day in Rochester, and the offices were deplorable, and I just didn't think it was an ownership group at a time I really wanted to get involved with.
One of our previous guests, Terry Hansen, who went on to the Atlanta Chiefs, interestingly, an interesting intersection. This was a couple of years probably before that period of time, and I think he was referencing, I guess, sort of I don't know if it's shady, but it's sort of a creative way to run the franchise almost on a yearly basis, where I guess the team was incorporated one year and then the next year it would incorporate separately and differently. And it just seemed to be sort of a comedy of, but you had a franchise there that, frankly, without it in the earlier part of the decade, perhaps might have helped ensure the demise of the NASL, because they were there in the thinnest of days. And I guess it just seems that that thinness continued as the NASL became more popular.
But it was really interesting for me, having worked with both leagues, because the New York owners said, "Hey, let's loan our players to the Rochester Lancers, where we have an ownership in," and I would do loan agreements between the Major Indoor Soccer League and the North American Soccer League, and vice versa. And the North American Soccer League office was not very happy with me. But, I had the approval of ownership to move players back and forth, and if a player was making $40,000 a year, and you could divide it up between, two markets with two different teams, it made sense financially. And, we worked very hard to accomplish that.
All right, so let's talk about that for a second, because that's a really interesting dynamic, right? So the fact that the NASL was not sort of, I guess, pleased at that, but that was also kind of a model that was going on in Houston too, right? With the Hurricane?
Yes, you did some good research, because I actually forgot about that. Yes, we had financially, it made sense to, take the players. You didn't even have to fly them in. They're not doing anything in the off season, so to speak. I mean, outside of some conditioning, and most of them had a chance to make a little more money and play soccer at a nice level. So it was a win situation, and you also had fans who were familiar with the Hurricane players in the North American Soccer League who would come play in MISL. So Kenny Cooper, who was a goalie, our head coach, he played in Blackpool in his early years, but he played in the North American Soccer League. So, it was very easy for him, having a relationship with the local players and such, to bring some players over across the street, so to speak. And we were very successful in terms of wins and losses, not as successful in terms of attendance.
Yeah, in Houston in particular, on both sides of the aisle, it seemed.
Yeah.
Okay, I just one last point on this. So the NASL not necessarily enamored with this sort of, I guess, shared player kind of agreement. What about the MISL management? Were they kind of okay with it?
Yes, they were fine because they wanted to upgrade the level of soccer. This helped keep costs down for the owners that started the league, so it made a lot of sense. And the arrangement that the commissioner and deputy commissioner had, I don't know if you're aware of it, was that they were going to get a franchise for free, each of them. If the league continued to grow, and let's say a franchise was worth $2 million, they could sell it to a group like yours in Chicago and take the $2 million and put it in their pocket, or move to Chicago and be the ownership group of the team. Each of them was, as a reward for starting the league and putting everything together, was entitled to one franchise each.
Yeah, that's interesting. But it's also interesting too, because the tension, I mean, obviously the NASL was at arguably its zenith with in 78, 79, you had 24 teams, and at least on paper it seemed like it was beyond fledgling at that time, huge crowds in New York and Tampa and et cetera. But it's obviously the indoor game from the NASL perspective, right, was always this sort of dalliance until the arrival of the MISL, right? And this, I guess, this sharing of teams, or this sort of renaming or I don't know, rostering, I guess, of the indoor and outdoor thing. You could see the NASL sort of kind of cursing themselves in that they kind of had the whole indoor thing to themselves prior, but really didn't do much with it. And it took the MISL to kind of kick them into maybe the opportunities around indoor, as well as this maybe beginning of a model of an idea where players could play both indoor and outdoor as a full year kind of enterprise.
You are 100% correct. Yes, that's exactly what happened. And they, again, wearing, having a shoe on each foot, with each league. I know every time I went to the NSL office, I think I was probably the only MISL person that went to the NASL office on a regular basis. I knew all the people and such. They were very uncomfortable in the loan agreements and the things that I was working on. And it was just one of those things. And they had wished they had started the indoor thing, because they could have economically done a very positive job of, utilizing the players year round, in the same market, but it just never really came to fruition.
Okay, so after the Houston experience and your Rochester brush with greatness, so to speak, what happened to you then at that time? What was the MISL, et cetera, career looking like at that point?
Well, this almost becomes the Bernie and John interview, if you will. Bernie wanted to orchestrate moving the Houston team to Baltimore. So I met Kenny Cooper in Baltimore, and they wanted Kenny to move and to coach the team in Baltimore. Kenny was not enthralled with the city of Baltimore. At that time, they were building the Inner Harbor. The streets were under just a lot of construction. We went on a day where the weather wasn't very good, And Kenny really wasn't excited about moving his family from Houston. His wife is from Texas to Baltimore. And subsequently, he decided to do it, and the Baltimore Blast was formed. And Bernie Roden brought Tim Lewicki, who is a brilliant marketing person, then with the St. Louis Steamers of the Indoor Soccer League, and myself to do administrative stuff. I left Rochester and literally got in my car and drove to Baltimore, and we opened up shop in the Baltimore Civic Center, and Kenny Cooper virtually brought most of the Houston Summit soccer team to Baltimore, and we started playing there. I hired the ticket manager of the New York Arrows to come down to Baltimore, and we wound up getting some of the Rochester players, and it just really took off. It was very successful in Baltimore. That was the first time I was with a soccer team that, we weren't giving away tickets. We didn't have to paper the house. We had really strong media coverage. The hockey, the Bullets had moved to Washington, and we were the primary tenant. I mean, the other tenant was the Baltimore Skipjacks of minor hockey league. So it really took off. The media embraced the team. Kenny Cooper was just a very, very likable figure to start the team. Tim Lewicki did really a superb job in marketing the team. It was a smaller arena, so you didn't have a 15,000 seat capacity. You had something that was more like 10,000. And we were doing very well at the turnstile and doing well on the field.
Yeah, there are a number of teams that were sort of credited with sort of the sis boom ba, I guess, of the presentation, right? Which today is now very commonplace in all of Major League sports, right? But I think maybe what you're talking about is, for those who don't remember or weren't there, right, a Baltimore Blast franchise that, I think in many respects was the template for pre-game introductions, and it was fun, and the music and the, there was a great Sports Illustrated article, I think written by Frank DeFord, if I'm not mistaken, about sort of the. And
ironically, I was very much involved with that, because when I was jumping ahead after Baltimore, I left, and Earl Foreman, the commissioner of the league, said, Hartford is having some ownership problems. Would you consider going up there? I said no. And my sister moved to Connecticut, and this put me within an hour of her. So I took the job working with the Hartford Hellions and jumped up there working in the Major Indoor Soccer League with Hartford. And after one season, the team was sold to a group in Memphis. And I elected not to go. I bought into the Hartford Hellions training facility. It was an indoor tennis facility with one hockey rink with turf on it, and we converted that to a more of a soccer-oriented sports center. And then Earl, so the team moved, and I'm there not working for a professional soccer or sports team for the first time in my adult life. And Earl Foreman calls me up and said, would you be do some consulting for our All-Star game in Buffalo? And I think he paid me $5,000 to come out there for 7 days. And I said, sure. So in the middle of winter, I go out to Buffalo, work on the All-Star game. And one quick side note, which I think you'll find interesting, I tried to get someone famous to kick out the first ball of the All-Star game. And the Edmonton Oilers were playing and staying at our hotel. I ran into Wayne Gretzky, who was certainly a teenager at the time, and I walked up to him, just like you'd walk up to anybody in the hotel, because in those days there wasn't like a zillion fans bombarding him. And I said, would you be interested in kicking out the first ball? I'm here with the All-Star game of the Major Indoor Soccer League. And he was familiar with the league. He said, I'd be happy to do it. I'm like, oh, my gosh, this is so cool. I can't wait to tell Earl Foreman. And he goes, well, you have to check with our coach. The coach's name was Glenn Sather. Glenn Sather was playing racquetball in the hotel. So I waited till he finished playing, and he came out and said, I have no problem with that, but you have to talk to Peter Pocklington, our owner, back in Edmonton. So a day later, Peter Pocklington called me up, returned my call, and said, why the heck would I want to promote your league? You're a competitor of the National Hockey League. And he basically hung up on me. So that was the end of getting Wayne Gretzky, who at one point I thought I had in the palm of my hand to kick out the first ball, because the way the schedule went, he was going to be in town for that time period. So anyway, I go back to my indoor facility in Hartford, where I'm doing this entrepreneurial thing of converting it to 2 soccer fields. And Earl calls me up, Earl Foreman, and said, would you be interested in being the PR guy for the Major Indoor Soccer League? And it was the office was in Philly, and Earl lived in Potomac, Maryland, which was kind of unique dynamics. So I met him at his home in Potomac, his home office, and he said, we're moving the league office to New York or Washington in the next 3 to 6 months. So we'll put your stuff in storage. And I said, okay. We agreed on a salary figure, and I moved to Ballackinwood, and we never moved the league office. So I spent 2 years working for the Indoor Soccer League in Philadelphia, and I lived in Earl Foreman's apartment. It was a furnished league apartment, and Earl came like once or twice a month, and he stayed in the master bedroom, and I had this furnished place to myself, totally at no cost. So my job, being at the league office in Philly, was every Tuesday I'd go to New York and I'd knock on the door at Sport Magazine, Sports Illustrated, visit some of the national media, and try to interest them in the Indoor Soccer League. And at SI, I had involvement with the Redskins over several years, and visited with Frank DeFord, who wasn't always in the office. And several weeks later, he called me up and said, my editor wants you to do a major story. He said, major story on your league. So the next thing I knew, I arranged a dinner with Earl Foreman, Frank DeFord, and myself at Duke Siebert's restaurant in Washington, D.C. And Frank DeFord said to Earl, I'd like Michael to take me around to as many games as possible in a week. And I literally live with Frank DeFord, may he rest in peace. As you know, he just passed away in the last 10 days, and I really got to know him. We stayed in every hotel in a room next to each other. We sat next to each other on an airplane, on an Amtrak. We went to as many games as we could in the league, and he wrote this 16-page article on the Indoor Soccer League. And I remember we had the league all-star game in Kansas City, and the magazine was coming out 2 days later, and the nice people at Sports Illustrated agreed to ship me a quantity to give to the owners in advance of the magazine being released, and Earl was so excited. It wasn't a real positive story, but it was a lot of publicity on the league, and we just gotten a game on CBS, so things looked like they were growing as far as name recognition and notoriety of our league. And it was Frank DeFord that put together this beautiful piece. And what you mentioned, too, about the crazy introductions in Baltimore, Sports Illustrated called me up, and they wanted an illustrator to come out and do a painting of the crazy introduction. And I have literally a framed picture of that. I wound up doing a 250 lithograph edition of that main feature in Sports Illustrated that we gave to each owner of a team in the league, and Earl kept the original, and that was kind of we hope was a big step in the growth of the league, was getting the publicity in SI through Frank DeFord doing a piece on us.
Yeah, that for our listeners, that drawing is just it's tremendous. It's fascinating. I'd love to get an original copy of that somehow. That's it's really something. But that article, he no fan of soccer though historically, Mr. DeFord.
Correct.
And
definitely.
What was the feeling of that exposure, right? That no exposure is bad, because you can clearly see in that article a little bit of hints of cynicism, right?
Yes, and he talked about, I think the headline has something like "Show Sex in the Suburbs." How soccer was appealing to the suburban soccer playing community, and that they were trying to get the female audience by these sexy indoor soccer players wearing short shorts, kind of thing. And it wasn't a flattering feature, but it was exposure in a magazine that had never given us more than a few inches of copy. Over the years, they may have done something on Shep Messing, but, that was our, big exposure, if you will, and having someone like DeFord do it as opposed to a no-name, added to the whole situation. And, it all coming out in, before an all-star game in Kansas City where we had a sold-out crowd and there was enthusiasm to expand the league, and there was a positive side, even though the article was not, 60% flattering to the league.
Okay, friends, sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to quickly remind you that today's episode of Good Seats Still Available is brought to you by our friends at Audible, the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre you could think of. Audible titles play on iPhone, Kindle, Android, and more than 500 devices and MP3 players for listening anytime, anywhere. And for a limited time, my audience can listen to a free download of any book that they choose, as well as get a 30-day free trial when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you can choose from over 180,000 titles, as we said, including one that I'm listening to right now. It's called The 10-Gallon War by John Eisenberg. That's the story of the NFL's Cowboys, the AFL's Texans, and the feud for Dallas's pro football future. Another one on my list, which I have yet to download but is on my queue, that could be interesting to our audience here, is called The National Forgotten League by Dan Daly, entertaining stories and observations from pro football's first 50 years. Those are just two of the many thousands of titles to choose from, and not just in sports history, but you name the genre that you might want to listen to, and Audible's got it. By the way, two guests perhaps that we'll have on the show, hopefully sometime soon. But again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial, as well as your free audiobook download to try it out for yourself. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. I think Hartford Hellions. The Hartford Hellions are an interesting, very, shall we say, forgotten footnote, even amongst MISL enthusiasts. So maybe if we could sort of step back a second and sort of maybe you can recount the story that was told to you before you stepped into it, and then maybe we walk through what was that story as you went through it.
Yeah, so I'd worked with the Baltimore Blast, and my job as vice president of administration was to compliment Tim Lewicki, who was just a marketing whiz, and he put the bodies in the seats and really generated tremendous enthusiasm. And I used some of my PR background with the radio, TV, and newspaper to really get people excited. And the media was looking for something that would, grab them in Baltimore. And after 2 years, I was pretty content with what had happened. And Earl Foreman, who I'd always had a nice relationship with, was telling me about Hartford. And at first I wasn't enthusiastic about going up there because the franchise was going through bumpy times, and the owner, Bill Chipman, had a reputation of having some financial woes and not really having a background that was familiar with the sport. So I agreed to go up there and meet with him, and he was a pleasant fellow. I knew about his background, and the league office told me they would back me financially should there be any problems, and that was all I needed. And my sister had just moved to within 45 minutes of where I would be based in Hartford, and I only have one sibling, so I wanted to be close to her. So as much as I didn't like winters in the northeast part of the United States, I became a part of the organization. And I remember going to the first game, and someone said to me, "Do you want a grinder?" And I said, "Excuse me?" I had no idea, a grinder was a sub, a hero, a hoagie in that part of the world. And we had a nice front office, but we had a lot of bumps because Chipman had financial issues, and I actually wound up staying in a nice townhouse with a garage that he owned, and I lived there for something like a year. Never paid a penny rent. So financially, it was worth it for me personally to be up there.
Now, I'm sorry. Was this after the first season that you came in, sort of the beginning of the second season of the Hellions?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And they were doing okay in the won-loss record. It wasn't one of the top-tier teams, and it wasn't one of the losing teams. And there was an enthusiastic front office, which made me enjoy going to work every day. And John Kowalski, the coach, was someone I had known for a number of years. He had coached previously in Pittsburgh for I forgot the name of the family.
This would be the Pittsburgh Spirit franchise?
Yes.
Oh, that would be the DeBartolos, no?
DeBartolo.
Yeah.
So, and I actually got to meet the elderly DeBartolo once in his office in Youngstown, Ohio, and it was quite an experience. And it was like meeting the Godfather to me. And I really enjoyed working with John Kowalski, and we had a nice indoor facility. And then when Chipman was having trouble continued financially, a group from Memphis said they would buy the team. And I was enthusiastic about it. I had met a woman who is now my wife of 32 years and didn't feel like leaving, and had an opportunity to buy into the training facility as my first investment as a solo entrepreneur. So I went full steam ahead with that, because the group in Memphis just didn't seem like they were my cup of tea. I didn't think it was going to be a good fit. And I'm kind of a Northeast guy, and at that time in my life, and felt comfortable up there. So I just stayed up there, and the team moved to Memphis, and I stayed in close contact with John Kowalski, the coach, but kind of, separated myself from everything else in a very tasteful way.
When did you know that things in Hartford were kind of awry? It sounded like that you were, I want to say living the life per se, but you were doing quite fine, and you had a good, management team there. But, from what I've read, Chipman was, quite the creative tax person when it came to some of these tax shelters that he was sort of doing separately from the team, and a couple of bounce checks here and there. Sort of the traditional path of questionable dealings, as we see in a lot of these conversations around teams and leagues that don't exist anymore. When did you get
in a morbid way, though, Tim, the bounce checks, like in Rochester, where literally the Rochester Lancers of the NASL, literally the staff would race to the bank. We had a bank in the same building as our front office, because in many instances, not once in a blue moon, some of those checks, when you were in the second group getting to the bank teller, they did not clear. And I'd never experienced, I worked for the Redskins, and, you get to ride in the front of the airplane, and you're getting these fat TV checks, and these people are just going, payroll to payroll, just trying to stay above water. And the situation started to happen in Hartford, and the front office started, feeling more day-to-day, looking over their shoulder, I felt. And, Chipman was the kind of guy that he'd move money from A to B, real quickly, and it was almost like throwing spaghetti at the ceiling, and sometimes it stuck and sometimes it didn't. I was in a unique situation in that, I had the backing of the MISL office, and, I was doing okay. So I would try to be positive, but I was also honest with the staff, and the staff, were not enthusiastic about working for Chipman. I felt I was a bit more popular than he was with the team that we had, and you have to have enthusiasm and energy just to go from game to game to put bodies in the seats and, put a positive front, with the media. We played in the Hartford Civic Center. It was a nice venue at the time, and we had a marginal office in downtown Hartford, and we didn't have a large staff, but it was adequate.
Well, it seems that there's some of the thematics here, where you've got sort of the league office that sort of, sort of has your back, so to speak, right? So
yes.
Maybe you can speak just kind of briefly to that. So how much of the league, was, kind of how much of the league was string pulled, if you will, from the central office? Because it seems like there's a lot of at least understanding or coordinated efforts to keep sort of things going league wide, where, arguably these should be independent franchises and teams and all that kind of stuff. But it seems like it's almost like an invisible hand of sorts.
You're right. You're dead on. I mean, can you imagine you're working for the New York Arrows, and then the next week you're in Houston, and you're working for the owner's son, and these two teams are competing against each other? I don't know how often in so-called professional sports you have that situation, whether it be coaches, the trading of players. You have the dynamics of the outdoor league and the indoor league, where this ownership group that I mentioned in New York was involved in Rochester, and it just creates unique dynamics. And there were times where there'd be some players that were being traded or talked about being traded, and I felt the league office, when I was with the teams, was looking at the big New York market and very much thinking in terms of, we just want to grow in the bigger cities and do whatever it takes. And there were certainly times where they may have crossed the line as far as doing things the right way, as other major leagues today operate in our country.
All right, so but it didn't stop you from being absorbed back into the league offices, right? So I guess after I was having fun, Tim, and that's is I told you. I mean, I had the honor, the pleasure, right place, right time of working for the Redskins. I think I'm still the youngest PR man in NFL history, being a PR director. And to go to soccer, because it was truly my love, and it was more of an entrepreneurial kind of thing, and to get to kick a ball around and just interact with, international soccer players, to me was, more fulfilling than a right guard or a right tackle. The NFL was kind of locked. It's a job for life if you want it to be that way. And the soccer league always had bumps. I remember one time when I worked for the league office, President Reagan invited the heads of all the sports leagues, and I'd say major sports leagues, but they invited us also, to come to the White House. And I wound up representing the league, because Earl Foreman was working on getting a new expansion team. The deputy commissioner, Charlie Avranian, was in Phoenix bailing out a team about to go bankrupt. And the two of them, as much as they wanted to have a presence at the White House with the NFL commissioner and the baseball commissioner, so the PR guy, much further down on the totem pole, I went to the White House and I had lunch with Ron and Nancy Reagan, and I have all these pretty pictures of it in my room here. And just because it was a constant thing of being reactive to, owners just having financial problems and trying to replace this franchise in another city. And if one owner had the financial wherewithal, who owned one team, as in the case of the New York Arrows, legally his son owned the Houston team, but, then you had John still owning the Arrows, even though he and Bernie were partners involved in the team. Then Bernie had the Baltimore Blast as his toy, as his team. And it was really interesting because, you're talking to John Luciani, he'll ask you a question, and in a way, he has his hand in the running of three teams. Yeah, that's fascinating. So, okay, so you're in the league now. So I think it's really important. I mean, the fact that you're at the White House is indicative, right? There were teams, I think the Steamers for sure, and maybe some others that were, if I remember this sort of the articles and the calculations correctly, there were at least one, if not more, MISL teams that were outdrawing some of the laggards in both the NHL and the NBA, I think, right?
And the two teams would be the St. Louis Steamers and the Kansas City Comets. Oh, my gosh. I told you, Frank DeFord, I had that memorable week with him, and we went right from St. Louis. You had Stan Musial as one of the owners of the team, so I had dinner with Stan Musial and Ben Kerner and another gentleman, and then we go to the old Checker Dome with that Old Oregon, and you got a full house, the crazy fans, and as you mentioned, the lavish introductions, which Tim Leiweke orchestrated. Then he moved to Baltimore and then topped it even there. His older brother, Tracy Leiweke, also a real savvy marketing individual. He ran the Kansas City team, and these guys were just the reason the league had the good notoriety that it did. Those couple of franchises, they kept the league average attendance high enough. We had a team in Wichita, and that did fine because there was no other professional game in town. And when I would, as a league office PR guy, based in Bala Cynwyd, right outside Philly, I would spend most weekends during the season taking the train to New York, going to an Arrows game, or gathering tapes literally that night or sunrise the next morning and driving to ABC, NBC, and CBS networks in New York, knocking on doors and more or less begging the weekend person to put some of this footage of this good TV sport on their feeds to all their affiliates throughout the country. So if you're in Wichita, a second-tier market certainly, but the MISL was very popular, you could get footage of other games right off the network feed and run it on your evening sports. And that really, drew attention to the fans. They got real excited by that. And the coverage in a Wichita newspaper compared to, the New York Times was quite a bit different in the smaller market for obvious reasons. But you were able to incorporate the whole league through video footage. This team's coming to town next week, and you had footage of their game yesterday from the network feed. So it's kind of minor league, but that was my job, and I was always so excited when, someone would tell me, oh, yeah, they ran the footage of, the Philadelphia Fever against the Wichita Wings, and once in a while ran on a market that didn't have a team that was considering a team because the sports director was looking for something, and you had, 3 goals scored in 47 seconds, and it just became part of your highlight reel.
So let's talk about television for a second, because obviously, we know today how instrumental television is, and I think it was just as instrumental, if not even more so then, in the early 80s, mid 80s, when you had, much more limited viewing options. But cable was becoming this thriving thing, and to the league's credit, had this game of the week on the USA cable network, right? And for many people, that was the sort of persistent exposure. And I know there were some dalliances with even broadcast television. I know CBS broadcast a game or two of the finals overtime and that kind of stuff. But can you describe sort of the hot and cold maybe relationship of the MISL with both cable and just anything related to television?
Yes. Earl Foreman, our commissioner, developed a relationship with Kay Koplovitz, who was the head of the USA Network, and they struck a deal to do more or less a game of the week. And we had Al Trotwig, who was a good announcer, doing the games, who loved soccer, and it had kind of a following. And you had the fans in Baltimore and St. Louis and Wichita, really getting decent ratings because their fans just wanted to see MISL soccer, even if their own home team was not playing in it. And that went on for a couple of years. They did the All-Star games, and it just became a weekly thing you could count on of watching indoor soccer. And it also allowed us to, spread footage around to other markets in the United States. As far as CBS, we hired an agent, a big New York agent. I think his name was Jim Morris, and he worked a deal out with CBS. We certainly didn't make money off it. I think you're actually paying for it or backing it at the MISL end to have, a game that year broadcast from Cleveland on CBS with John Tesh announcing the game. And that was just, our hope and prayer that this was going to put us over the top. And, of course, the game would air on Saturday afternoon, probably the the worst time to have TV programming, but it was sports. It was on a weekend in the wintertime, and there we were, and we were hoping it would increase from there. It never really did, but we kept Jim Griffin was his name, and he was with the William Morris Agency, the gentleman we had under retainer for several years that would knew the heavyweights and had the experience to help us get our foot in the door. But once we got the foot in the door of a CBS game, Tim, we didn't really were able to develop it further than that. The ratings weren't there to justify continuing it, and it was kind of a curiosity to the sports fan that was pushing channels on their TV. Many people only saw it for the first time, but it didn't take off like we hoped it would.
I actually met Kay Koplovitz a couple of times in my professional life in media, and she has some interesting, and I'd like to get her on at some point to talk more specifically about, because in many respects the MISL and sort of sports became kind of a linchpin in the early days of cable to kind of separate a USA Network from some of the other sort of startup TV channels. But she did regale me, and I need to get more detailed with her about the specifics as to why of some, shall we say, rather contentious conversations with Earl in terms of renegotiating or renewing contracts and whatnot. And I got the sense from Kay that he was quite the intense negotiator when it came down to certain aspects of getting television coverage.
Yeah. I mean, Earl was a tough cookie, and he is a very shrewd negotiator. But I'll tell you something: when you've got a unique situation, which we talked about earlier, Tim, where he and Eddie Tepper, the deputy commissioner, had a contractual situation where they could get a franchise whenever they wanted, year 2, year 17, and they would get that at no cost to them. So, getting on TV and getting franchises in the right market, if I was the owner of the Cincinnati Kids, I'd be pretty happy with that arrangement, because it was certainly an incentive for the two men that were starting this fledgling league to grow it quickly and efficiently and without any immediate cost back to them. And I think the deputy commissioner had a team in New Jersey for a season, and Earl never wound up getting a franchise, to the best of my knowledge.
Yeah. So we'll let this sort of be the sort of last point on the MISL. As you're talking to maybe one of the handful of season ticket holders to the New Jersey Rockets for their less than full season. So Ed Tepper, and indeed, it's just interesting, given what you said earlier about where the teams are located and the challenges of the Arrows on Long Island, attendance wise, that Ed Tepper getting and taking advantage of his franchise arrangement from the league would choose Northern New Jersey as the place to put that franchise.
Yes. Yep. I think he lived, in the Philadelphia area, so it may have been beneficial to him as far as being a part of, starting the organization the right way that he wanted to operate it, near him. But you're certainly oversaturating, a market. You could find a Wichita or a Baltimore market, and with a Lewicki type front office team, I think that would be a more realistic thing to grow, as opposed to, putting another team, in the New York metropolitan area.
That was also around the time that the Cosmos actually took indoor soccer seriously, and the NASL did too. And it was just a whole, there was an interesting, it'll be interesting about 20 people, but that year, that indoor year was just nirvana for indoor soccer fans like myself in Northern New Jersey. You had both the NASL and the MISL having two teams going on. You had a game almost every other night there in the Brendan Byrne Arena. It was great.
Wow. Wow.
Nobody was there, but it was
Right.
fun. It was fun to watch, except for people like myself. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So, but you then made the segue back to the NFL with another team kind of environment that we're interested in, because the iteration of the St. Louis Cardinals. So for some people in Arizona who don't even remember the fact that the Cardinals did exist prior to them, both in St. Louis
true.
and in Chicago. So how did you sort of segue from the MISL and then back to, I guess, relative stability maybe in the NFL?
Yeah.
I don't want to project on you, but
no, you're not putting words in my mouth. You're exactly right. I enjoyed working as the PR person for the MISL. I finished 2 years of it. I was having no problems. I was enjoying going to work every day. And it was pretty neat that I was doing my own thing, because your boss was in Potomac, Maryland, and you saw him a couple days a month or at a game at best. And, I was able to do my own thing, and I had a budget, and we had a staff, and we were getting things done, and I had PR meetings, and we'd actually have these people ordered to fly into town to try to move things up a notch as far as notoriety and creating awareness. So we had the All-Star game in St. Louis, and I was at this point engaged to a woman who just moved down from Hartford to Philadelphia, and within a couple weeks is the All-Star game in St. Louis, so I flew my fiancée out for the week or 5 days that I was there. And a buddy of mine named Kurt Mosier, he was the PR director of the Cowboys when I was the PR director of the Redskins. And had been in the league many more years than me. And he said, Michael, Bill Bidwell would like to have lunch with you tomorrow at the Stadium Club. Would that work for you? And it was a good time in my schedule. I said, sure. So it'd be nice to see him. When I advanced games, because I was in the same division, the Redskins and the Cardinals, I always had one trip to St. Louis, and St. Louis always came to Redskin land. And I always made a point of seeing him and talking with him, and had a nice relationship with him. And he had a reputation, perhaps in the 80s, of being a very frugal man running the organization, and they had some mediocrity except for the Don Coryell years, the Cardiac Cardinals. So I have lunch with him, and he said, I remember he had a bow tie on, we're in the Stadium Club, and he said, there's a couple of PR openings in the NFL. Would you be interested in leaving the Indoor Soccer League? And my initial reaction was, I'm getting married. To your point, Tim, there's some humongous security in being back in the NFL, and I kept thinking of San Diego. I think the San Diego job is open. So I said yes. So a few minutes later, he says, well, I'm looking for a PR guy here in St. Louis. And I didn't realize that Kevin Byrne had left. Kevin Byrne has been with the Baltimore Ravens since their inception, and is a friend of mine. And we sat down and talked, and he offered me just a terrific opportunity. And I said, let me talk to my fiancée. And she was kind of like, where's St. Louis on the map? She's a real New Englander. So I signed a 2-year contract, and I left the Indoor Soccer League. And it was, worth my while financially, and the security of getting married, because the league, the MISL, was doing satisfactorily. But the NFL was doing terrific. So, thinking as a family man for once and not as an entrepreneur, happy to move from one market to the other as a single guy, I jumped on it and went to the Cardinals. I mean, since I left college, I've been in 9 states with different sports teams. And, I figured, well, this will be a permanent arrangement. And from every little thing to helping me with the financing of my house and giving me a bonus for signing and paying airfare to my wedding, my best friend's wedding. I mean, this Bill Bidwell was just being so generous to me. Instead of putting me in a hotel, he put me in a suite in downtown St. Louis. And it was just one thing after the other, and we really hit it off. And I was very happy there. And my wife got a job at KMWX Radio, public relations. So between the two of us, we got invited to so many neat happenings in St. Louis. The only problem was we were the second-tier tenant in Busch Stadium to the baseball Cardinals. My first year, we came within a hair of making the playoffs, and I really, enjoyed working there, and I could see myself staying there for many, many years.
Were the seeds of a move from St. Louis being sown that you could tell at that time?
Yes, in my second year, it was Jacksonville or Phoenix, and it created a lot of tension. And I was fine moving because I felt like I'd have a job for life and could start a family and have the comfort of working for the same organization and building equity. And my wife wanted nothing to do with Phoenix. She's a New Englander. And I said, what about Jacksonville? If we go there? And she was like, I don't know. I said, well, it's warm weather. And she wasn't enthusiastic about it. And ironically, the Cardinals were in the World Series my second year. And a dear friend of mine from D.C., who just started a speakers bureau, the Washington Speakers Bureau, called me up and says, I know you don't have tickets for the World Series tomorrow night, but I'd love to take my dad. And I said, well, actually, I have 4 seats to every game, and you can have my seats. So he flew out with his dad, came to the World Series game, stayed in my townhouse, and the next day he asked me, hey, would you be interested in joining the Speakers Bureau? I said, no, I'm very happy here. I have a 2-year contract. He went back. And as my 2-year contract was up, I'm prepared to renew. I've got an excellent relationship with Bill Bidwell. We're kind of a 500 team, but we're in a good division. I'm enjoying the camaraderie with the other cities and the PR directors who were still there from when I worked for the Redskins in the 70s. So for me, it was kind of a coming home. And I got on the Super Bowl detail, which meant I got to go to the Super Bowl every year for 10 days working with the media. And it was just a really cool situation for me. And the off seasons are not as intense as they are now, and it wasn't a 24/7 job like being a PR director of a team is with the 24/7 nature of sports. And I was very, very comfortable. And I'm at the Super Bowl in New Orleans, and I get a wine and cheese basket from these 2 men, Harry and Bernie, and said, we'd like you to fly to Washington. We'd like to talk to you about joining the Speakers Bureau. So I said, fine. I said to Carolyn, I'll go visit my friends. And my wife's name is Carolyn. And very happy in St. Louis. Was sure, Bill Bidwell would keep me on for as long as I wanted to do. We were making some headway media-wise. And all of a sudden, they made me a financial offer. I said, well, let me check with my wife. I went upstairs, called her up, and she said, absolutely, that's close to New England. Let's do it. And, to her, the only salt water, she's a beach person, the only salt water in St. Louis was the saline solution in contact lenses because the Mississippi River didn't suffice as an ocean to her, even though many people in the Midwest, to them, it was their Atlantic or Pacific Ocean. So I sat down with Bill Bidwell, and he was very gracious, and he said, is there anything I can do to keep you here? And I said, no, I've made the decision, I want to start this thing. And I got very lucky and became part of a very successful lecture agency. And that was the end of sports for me. The only connection was I was booking, sports speakers to do events for corporations and trade associations. So it was a little bit of a continuation of public relations with, athletes and coaches and broadcast people.
All right. So as we wind it down, did you? I got to think that you're leaving sort of the pro sports sort of excitement and electricity and entrepreneurialism, especially on the soccer side. There was a bit of maybe a wistful kind of. Did you ever miss any of that sort of excitement as you became a bit more, shall we say, stable career-wise, or were you? Was it a period of time that you kind of knew that was kind of done and then you needed to move forward?
Well, I had relationships with the NFL from the 70s, and I really kept in touch. And every time, I had my MISL trips to New York every Tuesday. I'd take the Metro liner to New York and knock on the doors. I would visit the NFL office like every 3 trips. and say hi to the people and stay in touch. And they actually help me, with Sport Magazine. And, I just talked to so-and-so and he'll meet with you next trip to New York. And, so I kept the communication there. And I got to do instant replay. They called me up, and it was my first fall with the Washington Speakers Bureau. It's the lecture agency I work for. And I remember one of the two owners said, "I know you're going back to the NFL, we're not happy with you doing instant replay." And I said, "Well, I'm doing it on a weekend. I don't miss any company time." And, I said, "I give you my word, I'm staying here." And the instant replay was enough. I did that for 2 years, and that was enough of my NFL, dosage that I needed. And the idea of booking Terry Bradshaw or Joe Theisen, people that I knew from my NFL days as broadcasters and players, and being with them on site and that sort of thing, had a similarity and an overlap to some of the stuff, that I did in the NFL or with the soccer league. So I frankly did not miss it at all. And I wound up working at the Speakers Bureau for about 27 years. And I've been retired for a couple of years, and I run into people and says, "You must miss your job." And I said, "I don't miss it at all. It was great when I did it, but it was time for me to shake hands and, move on to the next chapter of my life." And I've been very lucky. I mean, knock on wood, if I got hit by a car today, I feel I am busy, I'm stimulated, I'm taking care of myself and my family, and it's really worked out well for me. That this chapter has really been neat for me. I'm doing a lot of community service, and I wouldn't trade it for the world.
So it's an interesting story arc. So as we wind it up, could you ever have imagined kind of where, I guess, sports in general, but in particular the sport of soccer, right? Because it's such a big part of your professional career that we've been discussing, would have ever gotten to sort of this level of consciousness in this country, right? Some of the seeds of what you were doing in the MISL and prior in the NASL, I think arguably has sprouted some very significant roots, maybe not in direct ways, but certainly you have a sport that is flourishing on many levels. Here in the United States, where, it was much more pioneering back in the 70s and 80s, and frankly, a lot less certain that it was even going to take root.
I had no idea that it could come this far. And I think back when I played soccer at American University, if you said to me that, the word of mouth of the sport of soccer, male, female, my daughter is a professional soccer player. And, she's played all over the world. And, I met my wife. We played indoor soccer together in Connecticut. And, it's like I'm so consumed to this day, with soccer. I'm taping 2 soccer games today. The USA is playing a team is playing Norway women's soccer. And I just texted my daughter, "Molly, how many players on the Norway team did you play with or against when you played your year in Norway?" And it's just so cool that I'm watching this on TV. And, my daughter has a connection to that. And the U.S. women's national team, 2 of her teammates in college start on the team. It seems like every third game I could watch in soccer on TV, which, today it's overwhelming how many games are on. There's some connection in my family or a friend of a friend. John Kowalski, this coach with the Hartford Hellions and the Pittsburgh Spirit, he coached in the NASL with Tampa Bay, Tim, and he has the distinction of being the only American men's coach to win a medal internationally in soccer. He coached the men's indoor team to a bronze medal in Finland. And who would have thought, we had dinner 2 weeks ago. He was in town for a soccer tournament. And, this guy has done indoor soccer. He's done outdoor soccer. He coaches college soccer now. And it's pretty cool that people are able to make a living in this country playing soccer. The college soccer is just elevated itself, men's and women's. They get some wonderful crowds in certain markets, and there's just a lot of energy, and that's a real dream to me.
Well, the dream is the interview that we just had, and the recollections, which is right down the pike of why we do this podcast. And I truly
you've done your homework, and you've brought things up that frankly I forgot about. And I appreciate you giving me the time doing the interview and just kind of reminiscing on some of the things that happened. And I've tried to be very candid and in things that I experienced. And I look back on the stuff with a smile on my face. And I've got a few pictures. I wish you were at my home and look at some of these pictures. You would just smile and laugh. And I have business cards of every team I was with, and it's a pretty fat collection of business cards and media guides and stuff, but, great memories. And I still stay in touch, with some of these people. I'm going to a wedding in Croatia next month, and I'm hoping to see this guy, Steve Jungle, who, I signed as a player with the New York Arrows many years ago.
The Lord of all indoors. Well, you can expect an email from me to try to figure out a way to somehow get him on the show at some point.
There you go. And Freddie Gregorov played for the Pittsburgh Spirit, a prolific goal scorer, then from Yugoslavia. He went to the New York Arrows, and John Luciani created this unique deal, and he drove my car while he was going from the Philadelphia Fever to the New York Arrows, and my license plate, New York license plate on my Cutlass Supreme was Arrows. That was my license plate, and Freddie Gregorov drove my car. John Luciani gave him my car and, worked a deal with me financially. Steve Jungle lived in my furnished apartment in North Shore Towers in Floral Park, New York. And, I'm down in Houston working for that team, and I get this phone call. It's Freddie Gregorov. His real name is Ferdo, and his last name is spelled G-R-G-U-R-E-V. He goes, "Mike, this is Freddie. I effed up your car." I said, "What'd you do, Freddie?" He says, "No oil." He never changed the oil. The car had no oil, and it was a lot of money in damages. And he goes, "Don't worry, John will pay for everything." I remember the phone call like it was last month. And here I am working for the Houston soccer team. This guy is leaving the Fever, going to the Arrows, driving my car, and the other players living in my apartment. Bernie and John just managed to, work everything out between Rochester, Baltimore, New York, and Houston. And it was sometimes a comedy of errors, but, they ran them as separate businesses and took it very seriously. And, a lot of fun was had by all.
And this is why we do this show, because those stories are just tremendous and should not be lost to history. We know where Freddie lives because, not personally, but we've been to his restaurant a couple of times in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And Fred will definitely be on our short list. And I look forward to regaling him with that story and getting his side of the story.
It'll be the same side, I'm telling you. And just way he called me and told me what happened, it's exactly the way it played out. And what a nice guy, as is Slavica Jungle, also known as Steve Jungle and Branko Segota and stuff. It was great bringing these guys in. And to digress back a little bit, Tim, Bernie Roden owned some apartment buildings in Brooklyn. So when we brought all these players in from Canada and the former Yugoslavia and everywhere we could find everybody, they all stayed at Bernie's apartment building, and there was like a shuttle service to an elementary school we had as a practice facility, and Don Popovich was the coach and a very volatile guy. Well, he coached the indoor team with the New York Arrows, and he coached outdoor in Rochester. So you have this back and forth dynamics also, where he had the same players in the Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum as he did at Hollander Stadium in Rochester, New York.
You can't make this stuff up, and that's and I appreciate tremendously your crystal clear memories of all this stuff, and I look forward to keeping in touch. And I tremendously thank you for spending a great deal of time with us to.
Well, thank you for having me. I enjoyed talking to you.
Michael Menchel, thank you so much. Look forward to staying in touch. Okay, there you have it. There's our chat with Michael Menchel, whom I thank tremendously for being with us and regaling us in some, eye-popping stories. And I always learn something from these conversations, and I certainly hope you do too. At some point, I almost look at this as a public service. I mean, come on, where's the last time you heard anybody talk about the old Hartford Hellions, or even remember the old Houston Summit soccer franchise, or heck, even debate the merits of the fringe heavy Colorado Caribou uniforms back in 1978. I dare you to find somebody else that's devoting any time or discussion to those very important topics and more than here on this podcast. And we love regaling and all that stuff. We love discovering new tidbits and information about such. And we love you for listening to us. And we appreciate it tremendously. We encourage you to keep doing so. Please subscribe to us on iTunes, wherever you find great podcasts. If you really like the show, please tell a friend or 10 of them and have them do the same thing. Show some love for us on social media, of course, please, on Twitter. That's at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. You will find a Facebook. That's it. Facebook. That's what the kids call it today. Page devoted to the show. And if all else fails, you can always go to our website for, all the information that you need about the show. An old episode, you want to find a book or a video or some other thing that we mentioned on the show, that's the place to find it, is our website, and that is goodseatsstillavailable.com. Visit there early and often, and there's lots of fun stuff to do. We will get an email list, newsletter going at some point soon. You can sign up for that too, all that kind of stuff. Goodseatsstillavailable.com. All right, I am babbled out, and I appreciate you listening this far in this show. We look forward to seeing you soon, and until then, take care, everybody.